Eric had learned to trust his instincts. And right now, they were screaming at him. The jungle around him was too still, the usual hum of alien wildlife disturbingly absent. It wasn't the comforting silence of solitude, but the kind that came before something terrible. He adjusted his grip on his rifle, scanning the towering, luminescent trees stretching high above him. Their twisted roots coiled like massive serpents, pulsing with a faint, bioluminescent glow. This planet, whatever the hell it was called, never let him forget he didn't belong. He should have died weeks ago when his ship went down. He wasn't even supposed to be here. A simple cargo run had turned into a nightmare after an unexpected gravitational surge knocked his vessel off course. Now, he was stranded on an uncharted world with no way to call for help and only his survival skills keeping him breathing. Eric took another cautious step, his boots sinking into the damp, moss-covered ground. He wasn't searching for trouble, just food, water, anything to keep him going. Instead, he found her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. The pale, violet hue of her skin blended almost seamlessly with the glowing flora around her, making her seem more like a specter than a living being. But as he stepped closer, the details sharpened. Long, flowing white hair cascading over her shoulders, strands catching the dim light like silk spun from stardust. And she was chained. Thick, metallic cuffs wrapped around her wrists and ankles, anchored deep into the gnarled roots of a massive tree. Whoever had done this hadn't just restrained her. They had meant for her to suffer. The metal had rubbed her skin raw, dark bruises blooming around the restraints. But despite the clear pain, she wasn't struggling. She was watching him. Her eyes, unervingly bright violet, like twin nebulae burning in the darkness, locked onto his with a mix of scrutiny and something else. Not fear, not desperation, expectation. Eric hesitated, his gut twisted. This could be a trap. A dozen scenarios ran through his head, none of them good. A lone woman, bound and vulnerable in the middle of an eerily quiet jungle. Either someone expected a fool to walk into this situation, or this was a whole new kind of problem he wasn't ready for. Then she spoke. "You are human." The words, spoken in perfect standard galactic, sent a chill down his spine. Not a question, a statement. Eric narrowed his eyes. "Yeah, and you are?" She tilted her head slightly, still studying him. "My name is Kalara." He waited for more, but she offered nothing. No panic, no pleas for help, just her name, delivered with the same weight as a declaration of war. He glanced at the chains again. "What happened to you?" She exhaled softly, shifting slightly against the cold metal. "I was taken. My enemies wish for my kind to disappear. If you do not free me, they will succeed." It wasn't a request. There was something unsettling about the way she said it. So calm, so certain. Most people in her situation would be sobbing, pleading, promising anything to be set free. But Kalara, she simply stated it as if she had already accepted whatever fate awaited her. And for some damn reason, that made Eric's chest tighten. "Who are your enemies?" he asked, stepping closer, inspecting the chains. They weren't like anything he'd seen before. Dark alloy, reinforced with what looked like an advanced locking mechanism. Whoever had made these had wanted to keep her restrained indefinitely. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she shifted her gaze toward the darkness beyond the trees, as if she expected something or someone to be watching. Then, in a voice quieter than before, she said the Krell. Eric stiffened. Yeah, he knew that name. The Krell weren't just dangerous. They were extinction-level threats. A race of warlords, brutal and relentless, who saw weaker species as nothing more than obstacles to be crushed under their expansionist conquest. He'd never encountered them personally, but he'd heard enough horror stories from other pilots. If the Krell were here, on this planet, he was already living on borrowed time. He exhaled sharply, looking back at her. "Why would the Krell want you dead?" Kalara's gaze flickered toward him again. This time, there was something deeper behind her eyes. A weight, a truth she wasn't ready to share. "I'm the last of something they fear," she said simply. That wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was enough. Eric cursed under his breath and pulled out his knife. If the Krell had gone through the trouble of leaving her alive, there had to be a reason. And that reason didn't sit right with him. He wasn't about to let them decide who got to live and die. The blade sliced against the metal cuffs, but the alloy was tough. It took him longer than expected, but after some careful maneuvering, the first restraint popped open. Kalara inhaled sharply, rubbing her now freed wrist, but said nothing. No thanks. No sigh of relief. Just that same unshakable calm. Eric moved to the next shackle. If you try to stab me after this, I'm going to be real pissed. Something flickered across her face. Was that amusement? I will not. The last chain fell away. For a moment, Kalara remained still, as if testing the sensation of being free. Then, slowly, she straightened her full height. Up close, she was taller than he expected, only a few inches shorter than him, her frame lean yet strong. Then, without warning, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his forearm. A sharp jolt pulsed through Eric's skin, not painful, but electric, like static energy dancing along his nerves. His breath hitched, and for a split second, something foreign flickered through his mind, a sensation not his own. Recognition, as if, for just a heartbeat, the universe had shifted to whisper, "You know her." His pulse pounded. He pulled back instinctively, flexing his fingers, trying to shake off the strange, lingering hum beneath his skin. Kalara studied him, her violet eyes unreadable. Then, in a voice softer than before, she said, "You have changed everything." Eric frowned. What the hell does that mean? She didn't answer. Instead, she took a step back, glancing toward the dense jungle beyond. Her posture had shifted, no longer a captive, but a warrior assessing the battlefield. "We should not stay here," she said. "They will return." Eric exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. This was a mistake. He could feel it, but something told him he wasn't getting out of it now. "Yeah," he muttered. "Figures." And as Kalara disappeared into the darkness ahead, Eric followed, knowing deep down that whatever had just begun wasn't something he could walk away from. The jungle swallowed her. One moment, Kalara stood before him, silent, poised, her strange violet eyes unreadable in the dim glow of the bioluminescent trees. The next, she was gone, slipping into the dense foliage without a sound. It was as if the night itself had reclaimed her. Eric took a half-step forward, instinct urging him to follow, but he stopped himself. She had left deliberately. No hesitation, no backward glance. Whatever she was doing, she hadn't asked him to come along, which left him alone in this goddamn jungle. With a muttered curse, he tightened his grip on his rifle and turned back toward his camp. He didn't like this. Not the sudden disappearance. Not the eerie silence pressing in from all sides. The Krell were still out there, and now so was she. He didn't know if Kalara was an asset or a problem, but she was something, and walking away from her felt like leaving a puzzle half-solved. But what the hell was he supposed to do? Chase after an alien woman who clearly knew this place better than he did? He'd barely lasted this long without getting himself killed. No point in tempting fate now. So he did the only thing he could. He waited. The night stretched on, long and restless. He stayed near his camp, scanning the jungle, listening for anything out of place. But Kalara never returned. By dawn, he wasn't sure if he should be relieved or concerned. Another day passed, then another. She was gone. Maybe she wasn't coming back. Eric told himself it didn't matter. He hadn't asked for company. He was fine on his own. He'd been alone since the crash, and if he was being honest, he worked better that way. People, human or otherwise, were unpredictable, and unpredictability got you killed. Still, something gnawed at him. The way she had looked at him before she left. The weight in her voice when she said, "You have changed everything." Changed what? It didn't sit right. The third night after her disappearance, he was sitting by his fire, absently sharpening his knife, when a shift in the air made his pulse spike. A presence. He wasn't alone. His fingers tightened around the handle, muscles coiling as he reached for his rifle. "It is only me." Kalara's voice. Smooth, steady, like she had never been gone at all. Eric turned sharply, and there she was, standing at the edge of the firelight. He hadn't heard her approach. She looked different. more composed, somehow. The exhaustion and tension that had clung to her before were gone. And in her hands, cradled carefully, was something wrapped in dark, woven fabric. Eric narrowed his eyes. Where the hell did you go? Kalara stepped closer, the firelight illuminating the ethereal sheen of her violet skin. I had to retrieve something. She knelt before him, setting the bundle on the ground. With careful fingers, she pulled back the fabric, revealing an object that shimmered in the flickering glow. A dagger, but not just any dagger. The blade was unlike anything he'd ever seen, forged from a metal that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. Intricate patterns wove along its surface, shifting subtly, almost as if alive. The hilt was wrapped in dark leather, worn and smooth from use, and at its center, embedded in the crossguard, was a deep violet gemstone that pulsed faintly, mirroring the glow of Kalara's eyes. She lifted it with both hands, holding it out to him. For you. Eric stared at her. What? In my culture, the first gift is sacred, she explained. It is given only to those who have changed the course of another's fate. He let out a short breath, unsure whether to laugh or argue. I don't think I did anything that deserves. You freed me. Her voice was quiet, but there was something unshakable in it. Eric looked down at the dagger again. He could feel the weight of the moment, the significance she placed on this gesture. This wasn't just a thank you. It was something more. He hesitated, then reached out, fingers closing around the hilt. The moment he touched it, a strange sensation rippled through him, like the pulse of an unseen current, thrumming deep in his bones. It was subtle but undeniable. His eyes flicked up to hers. What is this? Kalara studied him, then said a bond. Eric exhaled, running his thumb along the smooth leather grip. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but this felt important. He didn't know what the hell he had stepped into, but one thing was certain. He wasn't walking away from it now. Eric had been on edge since Kalara's return. She had disappeared into the jungle without a word, slipping into the darkness like a phantom. And now she was back as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. He could feel it in the air between them, an unspoken shift that made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. The fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows across Kalara's violet skin. She sat across from him, silent and composed, watching him with that same unreadable gaze. The dagger she had given him lay on the ground between them, its strange black metal absorbing the firelight rather than reflecting it. Eric turned the blade in his hands, running his thumb along the edge. It was impossibly sharp, humming with an energy he didn't understand. He wasn't a man who believed in fate or destiny, but there was something about this weapon, about her, that felt too deliberate to be coincidence. Finally, he broke the silence. You still haven't told me where you went. Kalara studied him for a long moment before answering. I had to retrieve something that belonged to my bloodline, something that should not have been left behind. Eric frowned. You're talking about this dagger? He held it up slightly. Why was it so important that you had to disappear into the jungle in the middle of the night for it? Her gaze flickered to the blade, her fingers tightening slightly where they rested on her knees. Because it is the last piece of my mother that remains. The words hit him harder than he expected. Eric looked at the weapon again, reevaluating its weight in his hand. It wasn't just a tool. It wasn't even just a relic. It was a legacy. The Krell took everything from my people. Kalara continued, her voice calm but laced with something deeper, something heavy. Our cities, our knowledge, our history. They burned it all. But this, she gestured toward the dagger. This survived. Eric exhaled slowly. And now you're giving it to me. Kalara nodded. Because you have altered the path I was meant to walk. That again. Eric had spent years surviving in deep space, hopping from one job to another, avoiding anything that smelled like responsibility. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a chosen one. He was just a guy who had happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet, the way she looked at him, as if he was part of something far bigger than himself, made him uneasy in a way he couldn't quite put into words. He set the dagger down carefully beside him. So what now? Kalara tilted her head slightly. That is up to you. That was the problem, wasn't it? Eric had spent weeks trying to get off this damn planet. The second his ship went down, all he had cared about was survival, finding food, avoiding whatever predators lurked in the shadows, and searching for any chance of rescue. But now, escape didn't seem so simple. Because if the Krell were really out there, if they were hunting Kalara, then leaving meant turning his back on something bigger than himself. He rubbed a hand down his face, letting out a humorless laugh. I should have just kept walking when I saw you chained to that tree. Kalara didn't smile, but there was a glint of something in her eyes. And yet, you did not. That was the real problem, wasn't it? He hadn't walked away, and deep down he knew that meant something. Before he could respond, Kalara suddenly tensed. Eric saw immediately the slight shift in her posture, the way her gaze flicked toward the trees beyond their camp. His instincts flared to life, adrenaline spiking. He grabbed his rifle, scanning the darkness. "What is it?" he asked, voice low. Kalara didn't answer right away. She closed her eyes briefly, as if feeling something he couldn't sense. When she opened them again, her expression was unreadable. "They are coming." Eric's grip tightened on his weapon. "Krell." Kalara nodded once. A cold weight settled in his chest. He had known, ever since she spoke their name, that this moment would come. But knowing it and facing it were two different things. He glanced down at the dagger, then back at her. His voice was quieter when he spoke next. "Do we run?" Kalara met his gaze, unflinching. "No." No hesitation. No doubt. Eric exhaled, his decision solidifying in the space between them. He reached down, picked up the dagger, and slid it into his belt. "Then let's get ready." The sky above them had shifted, darkening into a deeper shade of purple as distant storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Eric had learned quickly that storms on this world were violent, unpredictable, and had a knack for appearing at the worst possible times. But even that couldn't compete with the tension gripping the jungle now. The Krell were coming, and with them, war. Eric moved swiftly, his fingers tightening around the grip of his rifle as he double-checked the charge indicator. Beside him, Kalara had already begun to prepare. She moved gracefully, each step purposeful and fluid as she tightened straps of dark fabric around her wrists and shoulders, transforming herself from the quiet, mysterious woman he'd rescued into a fierce warrior ready for battle. He watched her silently, impressed despite himself. Her movements were precise, steady, calm in a way he envied. He could feel his pulse thrumming with adrenaline, his body on edge. Eric had faced danger plenty of times before, but something about this moment felt different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about standing for something, maybe for the first time in his life. He moved closer to her, trying to match her cool demeanor. "You ever fought the Krell up close before?" Kalara turned to him, her violet eyes gleaming in the fading twilight. She hesitated briefly, as though deciding how much truth he could handle. Finally, she spoke, her voice measured. "Yes, once." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Just once?" She nodded solemnly. "Once was enough. They're strong, fast, and ruthless. Their power doesn't lie only in numbers or technology. It lies in their cruelty. The Krell destroy to humiliate, conquer to erase. They fight without honor because they have none." Eric swallowed hard, considering her words carefully. "Any weaknesses?" She paused again, studying his face carefully, as though reading the uncertainty behind his hardened expression. Her tone softened slightly. "They underestimate courage, and they underestimate humans." The corner of his mouth twitched into a faint smile. "You sure about that last part?" Kalara's lips curved gently, the expression surprisingly warm. "Yes, Eric, I'm sure." They stood there quietly for a moment, eyes locked, an unspoken understanding forming between them. He felt a pull in his chest, a connection he hadn't expected. But before he could say anything else, Kalara stepped toward him. She reached out slowly, her slender fingers brushing lightly against his arm. He felt a faint spark again, just like before, a subtle ripple of energy dancing along his skin. It was warm, comforting, and impossibly intimate. Eric exhaled softly, tension easing slightly as he looked in her eyes, seeing vulnerability beneath her strength for the first time. "You don't have to do this," she whispered softly, almost reluctantly. "This is not your fight. You have already given me more than you realize." Eric smiled grimly, shaking his head slowly. "Too late for that. Besides, I'm pretty sure they're not planning to leave me alone anyway. Might as well take the fight to them." She held his gaze, gratitude, and something else, admiration perhaps, flickering briefly across her expression. "You are not like other humans I've encountered," she finally said quietly, breaking the tension with a faint smile. "You're stubborn, impulsive." He chuckled lightly, feeling oddly comforted by her blunt honesty. "Yeah, well, that's what got me stuck here in the first place." She tilted her head slightly, curiosity sparking behind her eyes. "Why were you here, Eric? You don't strike me as someone who travels aimlessly." He hesitated, the truth weighing on him. "I was running, I suppose. From responsibilities, regrets, take your pick. Thought space would help me find answers. Instead, I ended up crashing on an uncharted planet, rescuing an alien woman from a tree, and about to face off against genocidal maniacs. So much for escaping my problems." Kalara stepped closer again, her voice quiet but firm. "Perhaps you weren't meant to escape. Perhaps you were meant to confront them." He studied her face carefully, seeing sincerity reflected in her calm, steady gaze. "Is that fate talking?" She shook her head, her voice becoming gentle but resolute. "No, Eric, that's experience." A low rumble echoed from above, drawing both their eyes skyward. The storm clouds swirled ominously, lightning crackling silently in the distant sky. They both knew it wasn't just a storm approaching. It was something far more dangerous. "The Krell never give warning," Kalara said softly, eyes narrowing as she scanned the trees around them. "They'll attack swiftly, ruthlessly, hoping fear will break us." Eric clenched his jaw. "Then we won't give them that satisfaction." She looked at him again, respect deepening in her gaze. Without another word, Kalara reached out and gently placed her hand against his chest, over his heart. "Be careful," she whispered softly. "You matter more than you realize." Eric felt his heartbeat quicken at her touch, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with adrenaline. He placed his hand over hers, holding it there a moment longer. "Same goes for you." Their eyes met again, the moment charged with unspoken possibilities. It was a dangerous moment for vulnerability, for connection, but it was real. It was undeniable. A sudden rustling broke the spell, sharp sounds of movement in the jungle snapping them both into action. Kalara instantly withdrew her hand, turning toward the darkness, her posture shifting seamlessly from intimacy to readiness. "They're here," she breathed, the softness in her voice replaced by steel. Eric raised his rifle, his heart pounding hard against his ribs as he positioned himself protectively at her side. He felt no doubt now, only clarity. Whatever was about to happen, he'd chosen this. And for once, he knew exactly why. The jungle exploded into chaos as dark shapes burst from the trees, silhouettes massive and intimidating against the backdrop of the approaching storm. Bright beams of deadly plasma pierced the darkness around them, scorching the forest floor as Krell warriors surged forward, their monstrous forms illuminated by the flashes of weapon fire. Kalara sprang into motion, graceful and deadly, the blade in her hand slicing effortlessly through the attackers, each strike precise and powerful. Eric fired with practiced accuracy, rifle blasts punching through the hulking figures, adrenaline fueling his every move. Together, they held the line, driven not by desperation, but by a defiance neither had known they possessed. In that chaotic moment, Eric understood fully what Kalara had meant. Courage wasn't about winning easily. It was about standing firm in the face of overwhelming odds, choosing to fight when running would have been simpler. And as they battled side by side beneath the fury of the alien storm, Eric knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The battle wasn't over. Eric had been in plenty of fights before. Bar brawls on backwater colonies, skirmishes with raiders, even a few deadly close calls with corporate security forces. But this was something else entirely. The Krell weren't just trying to kill them. They were trying to erase them. The jungle was alive with chaos. Energy blasts tore through the dense vegetation, sending splinters of alien wood flying. The storm overhead rumbled like an angry beast, casting jagged streaks of violet lightning across the battlefield. The thick, humid air smelled of scorched earth and burning flesh. Eric moved purely on instinct, ducking behind the twisted roots of a massive tree as a Krell plasma bolt scorched the ground where he had stood a moment before. His pulse thundered in his ears, his breath coming fast and ragged. Across from him, Kalara moved like a phantom in the dark, her dagger flashing as she weaved between their attackers, striking with deadly precision. One of the Krell lunged at her, a towering brute clad in dark, ridged armor. He swung a massive blade downward, aiming to cleave her in two, but Kalara was faster. She pivoted at the last second, the blade missing her by inches as she darted inside his guard. Her dagger found its mark, plunging deep into the exposed joint between his armor plates. The Krell let out a guttural snarl before collapsing, dark blood spilling onto the forest floor. Eric didn't have time to admire her work. Another Krell came charging toward him, its heavy steps shaking the ground. He raised his rifle and fired 3 clean shots. The first 2 scorched its chest, but the third struck its neck, dropping it instantly. He barely had time to process his victory before another plasma blast exploded against the tree behind him. The force sent him sprawling forward, heat searing the side of his face. He hit the dirt hard, coughing as he struggled to push himself up. A shadow loomed over him. Eric rolled onto his back, just in time to see a Krell warrior standing above him, its massive weapon raised. The creature's glowing red eyes locked onto his, full of malice. Shit! Before the killing blow could land, a blur of movement shot past his vision. Kalara. She struck with terrifying speed, her blade slicing across the Krell's throat before it could react. The warrior staggered back, gurgling, clutching at its torn flesh. Kalara didn't hesitate. She twisted and drove her dagger up into its chest, piercing through the armor like it was paper. The Krell shuddered once, then crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Eric let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. You really do like making an entrance. Kalara extended a hand to him. You hesitate too much. He took her hand, letting her pull him to his feet. I like to call it strategic caution. She didn't roll her eyes, but he could feel the silent judgment. The jungle had gone quiet again. The only sounds were the distant rumble of thunder and the faint crackling of burning foliage. It was over. Eric looked around at the battlefield, his pulse still hammering in his ears. Krell bodies lay scattered among the undergrowth, their weapons cooling in the damp air. They had won, but Kalara's posture remained tense. They were only scouts, she murmured. Eric wiped sweat from his brow, his hands still shaking with adrenaline. Yeah, you mentioned that before. He let out a slow breath. So, where's the real problem? Kalara turned her gaze to the sky. Eric followed her line of sight, and then he saw it. Above them, partially obscured by the swirling storm clouds, something massive loomed in the upper atmosphere. A ship. No, a warship. The Krell weren't just sending more troops. They were bringing their full force. Eric swore under his breath. That's bad. Kalara's expression was unreadable. That is asterisk inevitable. Asterisk. He looked at her, taking in the tension in her shoulders, the way she gripped her dagger a little tighter. You knew this was coming. She nodded. The moment you freed me, this became unavoidable. Eric ran a hand down his face. All right, so what's the plan? Kalara studied him for a long moment. You still have time to leave. He let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. Not this again. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. You do not owe me this fight. No, he said, but I chose it. She held his gaze, something shifting in her expression, something almost unreadable. But there was a warmth there, buried beneath the exhaustion and the weight of what was coming. Finally, she exhaled and nodded. Then we fight. Eric smirked, tapping his fingers against the grip of his rifle. Good. I was getting bored anyway. Kalara stepped closer, and for a moment, the chaos around them faded into the background. The storm, the looming warship, the scent of blood in the air, it all became distant noise. She reached into the satchel at her side and pulled out something small, metallic, and etched with intricate designs. She pressed it into his palm. Another gift. Eric looked down at it. This one gonna explode or something? Kalara huffed a quiet laugh. It is a sigil of my people. She hesitated before continuing, her voice softer. It is given to those who matter. His fingers curled around the object, warmth spreading through his chest. He didn't have words for what this meant. So instead, he gave her a small, crooked smile. You sure you're not just giving me these so I don't run off? Kalara met his gaze, her expression serious. I know you will not run. And somehow, for the first time in his life, Eric knew it too. A distant, low hum echoed through the jungle. Engines. The warship was descending. Eric tightened his grip on his rifle. Guess it's time to see just how bad things are going to get. Kalara nodded, her violet eyes gleaming in the fading light. And as the storm raged above them, they prepared to face the battle that would decide everything. The jungle trembled with the weight of what was coming. Eric could feel it in his bones. The low, distant hum of the approaching Krell warship, the static charge in the air from the storm twisting above them. The world seemed to hold its breath, caught between the end of something and the beginning of something else. He tightened his grip on his rifle, casting a glance at Kalara. She stood still, her violet eyes locked on the sky, her face unreadable. But Eric had learned to see beyond her carefully controlled expression. There was tension in her posture, a quiet intensity in the way she held her dagger at her side. She wasn't afraid, but she was ready. He stepped closer. Tell me you have a plan. Kalara's gaze flicked to him. Survival. He exhaled. Yeah, figures much. Anything more specific? She hesitated, not because she was unsure, but because she was measuring her words, choosing them carefully. The Krell do not expect resistance, she said finally. They believe they have already won. She looked down at the metallic sigil she had given him, her fingers tracing its etched patterns. We will make them regret that assumption. Eric smirked despite himself. You're starting to sound like me. Kalara tilted her head. And you are beginning to sound like us. Before he could respond, the sky split open. A beam of searing red light tore through the storm clouds as the Krell warship descended, its massive form blocking out the stars. It was sleek and angular, built for destruction, with weapons bristling along its hull. A low, thunderous vibration rippled through the ground beneath them as it hovered above the jungle canopy. Then the first wave dropped. Krell warriors descended in clusters, their impact shaking the earth as they landed. They moved in perfect unison, their dark armor gleaming in the storm-lit night. Plasma rifles hummed to life, their weapons trained forward. There was no warning, no demand for surrender, just immediate, merciless intent. Kalara shifted into a ready stance, her dagger gleaming in the dim light. Now we fight. Eric didn't need to be told twice. The jungle erupted into chaos. The first Krell charged, a towering brute wielding a massive blade. Eric raised his rifle and fired. 1, 2, 3 shots. The first 2 bounced off the creature's armor, but the third found its mark, striking the exposed gap in its neck. The Krell staggered before collapsing, but before Eric could celebrate, another was already rushing toward him. Kalara moved like liquid shadow, weaving between their enemies with impossible speed. Her dagger flashed, slicing through gaps in their armor, striking where they were weakest. She was outnumbered, but it didn't seem to matter. Every movement was precise, controlled, a warrior born of necessity, shaped by survival. Eric focused on covering her, taking down the ones she couldn't reach. His rifle kicked against his shoulder with every shot, the air thick with the smell of burning plasma and blood. He dodged a wild swing from a Krell soldier, rolling beneath the strike before driving his knife into its exposed side. It let out a strangled snarl before dropping. But they kept coming. The Krell weren't just warriors, they were relentless. For every one they took down, more replaced them, their forces endless, unyielding. Eric gritted his teeth. They couldn't win like this. They were fighting ghosts, an enemy that never tired, never faltered. Kalara, he called, ducking behind cover as a blast scorched the ground beside him. We need to end this. Asterisk fast, asterisk. She looked toward the warship hovering above them, its weapons still primed, waiting. Eric followed her gaze. We take that down, we cut off their reinforcements. Kalara nodded. We must reach the command vessel. If we disable their core, the ship will fall. Easier said than done. But Eric had never been a fan of easy. All right, he said, exhaling sharply. Let's crash a ship. They moved quickly, cutting through the battlefield with brutal efficiency. Kalara led the way, her movements swift and deadly, her blade an extension of her will. Eric stayed close, covering their flank, his rifle picking off enemies before they could close in. The warship loomed ahead, its landing bay exposed, the faint glow of an energy field marking the entrance. That was their way in. Go, Kalara shouted. They sprinted forward, dodging plasma fire as they closed the distance. Eric felt the heat of an energy bolt skim past his shoulder, but he didn't stop. They reached the entrance. Kalara didn't hesitate. She plunged forward, slicing through the first Krell soldier that stood in their path. Eric followed, raising his rifle and firing in quick, control bursts. The ship was a labyrinth of dark metal and pulsing red lights. Alarm sirens wailed as they moved deeper, the Krell aware of their intrusion. But they didn't stop. They pushed forward, cutting through opposition with ruthless determination. Finally, they reached the core chamber. A massive cylindrical structure pulsed with energy, suspended by thick cables that fed into the ship's main systems. This was the heart of the vessel. Kalara moved to the control panel, her fingers flying over the alien interface. Eric covered her, picking off the Krell soldiers that stormed into the room. Whatever you're doing, do it fast. Kalara didn't answer. She didn't need to. The ship suddenly lurched. A deep, warning siren blared through the halls, and Eric saw the core flicker, its energy field destabilizing. Kalara turned to him, urgency in her eyes. It will collapse. We must leave now. Eric didn't argue. They ran. The ship shuddered violently, the walls groaning as power flickered and failed. Explosions rocked the corridors behind them, sending debris raining down. They reached the edge of the landing bay, just as the entire vessel let out a deep, guttural groan. Eric didn't hesitate. He grabbed Kalara's wrist and leapt. They hit the ground hard, rolling as a wave of heat and debris blasted outward. The warship faltered, tilting as its systems failed. Then, with a final, deafening explosion, it plummeted from the sky, crashing into the jungle below. Silence. The Krell forces still standing hesitated. Their command was gone. Their reinforcements were gone. And they knew it. One by one, the remaining soldiers fell back, retreating into the shadows of the jungle. Eric lay on his back, staring at the burning wreckage, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Kalara was beside him, equally exhausted but alive. They had won. A long moment passed before she turned her head to look at him. You are reckless, she murmured. Eric let out a breathless laugh. Yeah, well, it worked, didn't it? She exhaled, shaking her head before pushing herself up. We should go. Others will come. Eric sat up, rubbing the back of his neck. You think this is over? Kalara studied him, her violet eyes thoughtful. No, but this was a beginning. He looked at her, taking in the quiet certainty in her expression. Then he nodded. All right, let's see where this takes us. And together, they disappeared into the jungle, ready for whatever came next. The fire from the wrecked Krell warship still burned in the distance, casting an eerie glow across the jungle. Smoke curled into the night sky, twisting between the massive trees, and the scent of scorched metal and damp earth lingered in the air. The battle was over for now, but Eric could still feel the tension in his bones, a restlessness that had nothing to do with war. Kalara stood beside him, watching the distant flames with an unreadable expression. The wind tugged at her white hair, loose strands catching the glow of the embers. Her violet skin shimmered faintly under the light of the twin moons, and for a moment, she looked otherworldly, untouchable. But she wasn't untouchable. Not anymore. Eric had spent his life avoiding attachments, drifting from one place to another without ever truly belonging. And yet, standing here with her, in the aftermath of the battle, he felt something he hadn't in years, maybe ever. He belonged. Kalara turned to him, sensing his gaze. "You are thinking too much." Eric huffed a small laugh. "Yeah, I'm not used to sticking around long enough to have thoughts that matter." She studied him, her violet eyes sharp, thoughtful. "But you are still here." He swallowed. "Yeah, I am." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full, charged with something heavier than words, something unspoken yet undeniable. Kalara stepped closer, closing the space between them. She reached out, fingers ghosting along his arm, trailing up to his shoulder, his jaw. Her touch was light at first, as if testing something, as if giving him a chance to pull away. But Eric didn't move. His heart pounded, heat curling through him as he reached for her in return, his fingers finding the smooth warmth of her waist. She let out the softest sigh at the contact, barely audible, but it sent something molten through him. "Kalara," he murmured, not entirely sure what he was asking for. She lifted her chin slightly, her gaze locked onto his. "Do you not understand yet?" "Understand what?" Her lips curved just slightly. "That you are mine now." Then she kissed him. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't uncertain. It was acclaiming, slow, and deliberate, as if sealing something between them that had been inevitable from the moment he freed her. Eric inhaled sharply, his hands tightening around her as he deepened the kiss. She tasted like the wild air of this planet, like something untamed, something new. His pulse thrummed in his ears as she pressed closer, her body molding against his with a confidence that left no room for doubt. His back hit the tree behind him, and Kalara followed, pinning him there with her presence alone. She moved with purpose, one knee sliding between his legs as she leaned in, pressing her body flush against his. The heat of her skin, the way she moved, strong, sure, hungry, sent a deep shiver through him. Eric had never felt anything like this before. She broke the kiss only to trail her lips along his jaw, down to the sensitive spot beneath his ear. A slow, teasing brush of her teeth made his breath stutter, his fingers digging into her hips as he fought for control. "Kalara," he rasped. She hummed, a low, pleased sound that sent a rush of heat through him. "You are different from the men of my kind," she murmured against his skin. He let out a breathless chuckle. "That a good thing?" Her answer came not in words, but in the way she moved against him, shifting her weight, pressing closer. Eric groaned, tilting his head back against the tree, his grip tightening around her. "You really don't like taking things slow, do you?" Kalara pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, her lips slightly parted, her breath warm against his. "I have waited long enough." His chest rose and fell with deep, uneven breaths. "Yeah," he admitted, voice low. "Me too." She reached for his hand, guiding it to the smooth, bare skin of her lower back, and he swallowed hard, his pulse hammering as he let himself touch, explore. She arched into him, letting out a quiet, breathy sound of approval, and the sheer intimacy of it sent a jolt of pleasure straight to his core. God, she was beautiful. Kalara wasn't fragile. She wasn't soft in the way human women were. She was powerful, honed by survival, shaped by battle. And yet, here, like this, she let herself be something else, something vulnerable, something real. Eric's breath hitched as she shifted again, a slow, deliberate press of her hips that sent a fresh wave of heat through him. His hands roamed, memorizing the curves of her body, the way she reacted to every touch, every movement. She made a sound low in her throat, a soft, shivering exhale that sent his control unraveling. "Kalara." Her mouth found his again, cutting off his words with another deep, claiming kiss. And this time, neither of them held back. Time blurred after that. Fingers tangling in hair, bodies pressed together in slow, desperate movements, Whispered names and soft, breathless moans exchanged in the darkness. The jungle storm raged overhead, wind howling through the trees, but here, in this small pocket of warmth, nothing else existed. Only them. Only this. Later, much later, when they finally lay tangled together beneath the massive roots of an ancient tree, Kalara traced slow patterns against his chest, her fingers light, thoughtful. "You are not what I expected," she murmured. Eric let out a lazy, satisfied hum. "Good or bad?" She smiled, tilting her head to press a lingering kiss against his shoulder. "Good." He chuckled, running his fingers through her silken hair. "Guess I'll take that." Kalara lifted her gaze, something unreadable flickering in her violet eyes. "The war is not over," she said softly. Eric nodded. "I know. You could still leave." He rolled onto his side, brushing a knuckle along her cheek, watching the way her expression softened at the touch. "I could," he agreed. "But I won't." She exhaled slowly, closing her eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. "You are mine now," she whispered, the words carrying a weight beyond simple possession. Eric leaned in, pressing a slow, deliberate kiss against her lips before pulling back just enough to murmur against them. "Yeah, and you're mine." The storm outside raged on, but inside their small refuge, wrapped in each other's warmth, it didn't matter. Whatever came next, more battles, more wars, more impossible odds, they would face it together. And this time, neither of them would be fighting alone.